Hi, I'm Elizabeth, and you're listening to the Rights of Nature podcast. My guest today is Sean Butler. Sean is the founder of Emergent Law and is working on rights-based approaches to protecting the natural world. Welcome, Sean. Thank you for your work in the world, and thank you for being our guest on the podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Beth.
Now, you recently wrote an article about why corporate rights and preemption make it impossible for us to protect the environment. Can you describe what corporate rights are and what preemption is, and talk a little bit about why they make it so hard to protect the environment within our existing legal system?
Yeah, for sure. So by corporate rights, we're referring to the laundry list of civil rights that have been granted to corporations over the course of around 180 years of judicial decisions. In other words, courts have determined that nearly every one of the civil rights granted to individuals through various amendments to the U.S. Constitution and also state constitutions also apply to corporations. The one that sticks in most people's minds, of course, is the Supreme Court decision in the Citizens United case, determining that corporations have First Amendment rights to free speech, which rights were being impinged by restrictions on political donations. But corporations have also been determined to have Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable searches and seizures, Fifth Amendment rights to due process, Sixth and Seventh Amendment rights to trials by a public jury, and 14th Amendment rights to due process and equal protection under the laws. By preemption, we're referring to the doctrine that federal laws trump state laws and state laws trump local laws. We often think of preemption in very positive terms, and not and understandably, when we think about the 14th and 15th Amendments being used to justify striking down Jim Crow laws in the 1960s. But what even just a bit of historical research shows is that far more often preemption has been used as a means of harnessing the police power of the government to protect corporate civil rights. The clearest example that my colleague Will Falk and I have found is the following. Between 1868, when the 14th Amendment was ratified, and 1912, the Supreme Court ruled on only 28 cases involving the rights of African Americans to equal protection under the laws, and a mind-boggling 312 cases on the rights of corporations and their so-called right to equal protection. Now, look, I'm a corporate lawyer by training and practice, so I'm not opposed to the corporate form itself. But to my mind, there's a real problem with granting civil rights to corporations. The reason is very simple. Rights don't just jump off the page and enforce themselves. They are only enforced if a court rules in favor of the person seeking to uphold their rights. And accessing the courts, as we all know, costs money. Naturally, then, corporations with far deeper pockets than any ordinary citizen can afford to enforce their rights more effectively and more often than the average Joe. And it doesn't stop with the courts. Corporations have long known what an effective tool preemption is, so they've lobbied not just at the federal level, but at the state level as well, to pass what are called blanket preemption laws, prohibiting local governments, namely towns and counties, from prohibiting or regulating behavior that is specifically allowed by state law, which of course industry groups have already lobbied their legislatures to enact. So I know it's a long-winded answer, but corporate civil rights and the doctrine of preemption are two sides of essentially a very pernicious coin used to prohibit meaningful environmental protections at the local level. When communities try to do so, whether it's to, protect the groundwater from being extracted by bottled water companies or prevent their communities from being used as dumping grounds for sewage sludge, preemption is one of the first tools that corporations invoke to argue that such actions are void. And if that doesn't work, then the corporations sue the local governments, not only claiming that those laws violate their civil rights, but also suing the towns for damages because the towns are effectively taking the corporation's property.
It's just overwhelming when you put it all together like that. Oh my gosh, it's like the David and Goliath story in extreme.
Yeah, it really is what makes this work a response to the acknowledgement of what our legal system what it is, what it does, and how we got here.
Yeah. It does make me wonder about the mentality of the judges who, passed those 312 cases in favor of the corporations. It's like, did they not anticipate that this would take so much power away from the people when they were doing that?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I'm just starting to dig into some of those opinions. What we have seen so far is that there is a very clear desire to promote commerce. And anything that stood in its way was they were going to find a way to undermine.
Yeah. Well, and I that makes me think of Washington State, where we are, was
Hmm.
sued by six other states that said you can't tell us not to ship coal to your terminals because of the
Right.
Commerce Clause. We have more rights.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. That's a domain that is regulated by the federal laws, and so a state can't prohibit activities that are specifically allowed by federal law. So that's another example of preemption.
Yeah. Wow. Well, we're here on the Rights of Nature podcast to talk about rights of nature. So, and this is something you work with all the time. Can you give a summary of what rights of nature is to you and how rights of nature laws are meant to upend the existing legal system in order to allow communities to protect their environment, even in the face of this incredible corporate juggernaut that you just described? And
Hmm.
of course, that protection being vital to the human communities as well as the natural communities in that environment.
Yeah, if we're going to take seriously the systemic realities that we were just talking about, then the rights of nature movement is fundamentally different in that it's not just seeking to pass new laws or enforce existing laws better or refine the number of parts per million that are allowable in any given form of pollution. If we take seriously the notion that the system really does not allow meaningful protection, then we really are talking about movement. And so the rights of nature movement is just that. Uh, it's a it's a process by which people are working to ascribe legal rights to nature. And oftentimes those are formulated as the rights to exist, flourish, evolve, and regenerate itself. And, we often there are two wonderful, powerful examples in history of movements like this. That's namely the abolitionist movement and the suffragist movement. Like both of those, what we're undertaking here is the process by which a class of beings previously considered only property, right? So African Americans or women in the two previous movements, by which those beings interject themselves into the legal system as rights bearing subjects, into the very legal system that treated them as legal objects. One of the most common objections, often from other environmentalists, is that, the rights of nature movement is just pie in the sky. And we need to take a more practical approach, work within the system we have, and that's going to be the way to protect the environment. I like to call that mentality the slave reformers argument, because the biggest resistance the abolitionists met actually was from other well-meaning people who thought we just needed more and better laws regarding the treatment of slaves. But history has shown that as a culture, we're pretty terrible at protecting beings who we treat as property. I mean, I don't mean to be too punchy here, Beth, but you tell me, is there a difference between you being legally entitled to hold property in your own name and cast your own vote, or would you be just as well off if your father or brother had the right to do so on your behalf?
No, I think there's a big
Yeah.
difference.
Yes, slightly rhetorical question. Yeah, there's a really big difference. So the rights of nature movement is about acknowledging that difference and recognizing that until we treat nature with the dignity of a legal subject, we're really just polishing the brass on the Titanic. I mean, the point wasn't that the slaves needed to only work 9 to 5 on weekdays. The problem was they were slaves. Similarly, the essential problem underlying the imminent extinction of the southern resident orcas isn't that the Department of Fish and Wildlife didn't consider the latest science regarding salmon populations when setting commercial fishing limits. The problem is that our culture of more, more, more is violating the orcas' fundamental ability to exist in the Salish Sea as they've done for millennia.
Yeah, that's a really good way of describing the culture we live in, the more and more and more culture, because
Yeah,
we're always growing and always wanting to ship more oil or more coal or take more fish, or the population is growing. It's just
right. Or even go see the orcas more and more. I mean, that's the one that is really hard for me to hate and accept. Is it's the whale watching. I totally get it. I'd love to see them too, but it's a real problem for them.
yeah. I really appreciate how you describe rights of nature in this way. It's not about doing slightly less harm, but really completely reframing how we think about nature.
Hmm.
And you mentioned kind of the traditional ways that we try to protect nature and the environment is to bring lawsuits under local, state, or federal
Hmm.
laws, like the
Hmm.
Endangered Species Act, the Clean Air Act, those kinds of laws. And that's, as you said, the we just need better laws approach.
Hmm.
And we know that for the most part, with a few exceptions, that approach has failed, even to slow the rate of harm, much less stop it.
Yeah.
And then there are several other approaches that people are trying. The Our Children's Trust
Hmm.
idea was just in the news last week. Unfortunately, they lost their lawsuit, but that they're using the public trust doctrine. And then I've heard people talk about the natural capital approach
Hmm.
to saving the environment. Can you talk about those legal approaches and how they differ from rights of nature?
Yeah, it's a big question. um, and I confess I'm not super well read with respect to the public trust case or the natural capital approach, but I think I know enough to take a stab with some relatively broad brushstrokes. Um, I guess at the highest level, I would humbly suggest that all three approaches, so the standard regulatory approach, the public trust doctrine, and the natural capital sort of strategy, are all kind of missing the elephant in the room, or at least not naming it. And to my mind, as we've said, that's the simple fact that the natural world itself has a right to exist and coexist with humans, and that humans are fundamentally connected to it. Um, Western industrial consumer culture flies in the face of that connection and has done so for hundreds or arguably thousands of years. And that's what we really need to rethink and transform. We don't need to more closely regulate the destruction of the natural world as though, you know, that destruction doesn't affect us. We don't need to put a price tag on what's being consumed, although, in terms of the natural capital approach, I appreciate at least trying to talk about the value of the natural world, but to my mind, that comes up short. And we need to do more than assert that humans have a right to life on an ecologically balanced planet, sort of as the public trust doctrine litigation is doing. To my mind, we really need to acknowledge that the natural world all around us is a manifold, complex, and beautiful system of ever evolving life that has its own integrity and dignity. You know, I mean, we can also see the limitations of these approaches by analogy to the issue of slavery again, right? The problem wasn't we needed better regulations, nor did we need to put a price on what each slave as an asset was to its owners or his or her owners. And even the moral argument, taken by many at the time that slavery violated the ethical framework of some good, outstanding white folk, missed the point. I mean, I honestly don't think that many slaves at the time cared much that the conditions of their existence rubbed some people's morality the wrong way. They cared that as human beings, they were being deprived of their own rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So, again, those are broad brushstrokes, but I come back to the notion of acknowledging the inherent rights of nature and the need to transform our legal system and our way of thinking to see and respect those rights and live in relationship with them. That's what needs to be addressed. As much as I hate to say it, anything less, I think, is going to invoke and recapitulate the very norms and values and institutions that have led us to this disastrous place in which we find ourselves.
Yeah. It's interesting to extend the analogy of slavery to where you did in comparison to like the natural capital approach of putting a price on nature.
Mm-hmm.
That really makes that idea really clear. This is what we're doing.
Yeah. I think it is, and a lot of folks will say, "But hey, those were human beings we were talking about, African Americans and women," and I completely agree. But I think that misses the point. I mean, as a corporate lawyer, I've spent my entire career, working with corporations as legal entities. So, as some people say, if corporations can have rights and be um, a legal subject, why can't nature? So we've already got the precedent there. So I don't have much sympathy for the notion of distinguishing between rights of nature and the abolitionist movement and suffragist movement on that basis.
Yep. And when I think about the orca in particular and all the orca that are enslaved within places like SeaWorld,
Mm,
despite the fact that we
mm-hmm,
know how desperately they want to be with their families, how they talk to each other, how they move through the world,
mm-hmm.
that also to me makes that comparison very clear too.
Yeah, it absolutely does. I don't know that I'm going to be able to watch the movie Blackfish twice. That was once was heartbreaking enough.
Yeah, agreed. One of the concerns that people have with the rights of nature legal approach is enforcement of the law. That's a question I've run across
Mm-hmm.
many times. Everybody wants to know, well, how are you going to enforce it? Especially if it's a broad rights of nature law that
Yeah.
talks about the rights of nature as a thing and not just banning a certain activity. That recognizes the rights of humans to have a clean and healthy environment and the rights of the environment to exist and thrive, because it leads to all kinds of sticky questions about how one would enforce that law. And so then the
Mm-hmm.
conversations get bogged down in the details
Mm-hmm.
when really the rights of nature process is, as you've just said, about changing how we think at a systemic level, that big picture level, changing our view of nature as resources to be exploited, to more of a this idea of nature is something we're in relationship with that needs to be healthy and thriving in order for us to be healthy and thriving.
Mm-hmm.
My friend Kai likes to say it's about giving nature a seat at the table so that all the
Yeah.
decisions we make are taken with the health of nature and natural communities we live in mind, rather than focusing on how much harm we're permitted to cause in order to do what we want to do. So I kind of see it as flipping the normal way we think about how to live in our communities on its head. And I think that's hard for people.
Yeah. It is. I've heard the same objection myself. I guess it's a common pitfall, I guess you could call it, in sort of working to understand what this is all about. I think the easiest way to address the concern is to refer back to the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the US Constitution. None of us question the validity, the importance, or even the enforceability of our First Amendment rights to free speech or freedom of religion, or our 14th Amendment rights to due process or equal protection of the laws. Was there uncertainty about what those meant in practice when they were passed? I have to believe there was. Has it taken decades or centuries worth of litigation to shape what those rights mean in practice, especially 250 years after they were enacted? Absolutely. Do either of those realities mean that we should have waited to pass those amendments until we could codify in minute detail what the amendments mean, what constitutes a violation, and how they should be enforced? Absolutely not. Those amendments are merely the beginning, the foundational manifestation in our legal system of what we believe about ourselves as humans and how our human dignity ought to be recognized by our system of government. And that's precisely what these local rights of nature laws are intended to do with respect to nature. I do think we get tripped up by the fact that they're local laws, not amendments to our state or federal constitutions, because we tend to think of local laws as very practical ordinances in terms of things like zoning and land use and traffic laws and the like, all of which are very specific and prescriptive. But the reason rights of nature laws are being proposed at the local level is because, quite frankly, it's state and federal so-called environmental laws that permit environmental destruction that are getting in the way of environmental protection. So the rights of nature movement is about going back to the beginning, so to speak, to the locus of where I think all democratic authority is vested, the people. And we're inviting the people to retake their political authority and enact laws that affect their local community, rather than waiting for state and federal bureaucracies to, quote, do something. And, if that feels outlandish or uppity to folks, I think we would all do well to remember that before there was a Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson expressing the will and intent of all 13 colonies, there were upwards of, I think, 90 or more separate declarations of independence passed by local townships and villages throughout the colonies. Look, we're descended from hardy folk who were willing to be outlandish and uppity in order to ensure their governments reflected their collective will. And I think it's high time we remember that and draw upon that heritage to transform our systems of government to reflect an inherent respect for mutual relationship with the natural world. We've got to solve for the problems in front of us today.
That's a really interesting point that you make about how, we do tend to think of local laws as very practical. And
Yeah.
so seeing a law being proposed at the local level, which is called a Bill of Rights, is not usual for people. And I think that we've been trained to think of those types of things as coming from above, as coming from the state level or coming from the federal level. And yet, like you said, you look at the Washington State Constitution and especially with home rule counties, the will of the people is what said. That's that's the thing, right?
There's still some vestiges of the very early, I guess I'd call it a political impulse that was manifest in all those local declarations of independence back in the 18th century. But it's just so foreign to us now, unfortunately. And it's often, the notion of home rule is poo-pooed. It's seen as being either xenophobic or, just a bunch of folks that don't want to be told what to do. It's really sad. I've heard another commentator call it the need to regain our political self-respect. And I think I think that's right on. We've gotten lost in pursuing careers and sort of essentially serving ourselves, assuming that somebody else is going to take care of it. And I think it's time we let go, disabuse ourselves of that misunderstanding.
Yes, as the bureaucracy gets entrenched and more entrenched.
Yeah. Well, and as people and corporations learn how to work the bureaucracy to their favor,
Yeah.
it has gotten well past what I think anybody would acknowledge is the intent or the beauty of our country and our system of government, if we were to really look at it in the face.
Well, and going back to what you said at the very beginning about how so many decisions have been made in the favor of corporations, it really feels like the people who are making those rulings are forgetting where the country was founded.
Yeah. Yeah.
I like to call America the corporatocracy now because the corporations do have so much control.
Yeah. It's not, I used to think that was sort of a way left, sort of label, but I've really come around and changed my view on that subject. I really do feel like we live in a corporate state that happens to be masquerading as a democracy.
Well, and how much corporations have changed since the very beginning when they had much less power and they were meant to be reevaluated. They were meant to be temporary. They were meant to get something done and then stop. And we've lost that view of corporations entirely.
Yep.
So
yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. There's a lot of really interesting material written by Thomas Paine and others around the time of the Revolution and the early days of our country, just railing against corporations even back then and arguing passionately about putting limits on what they can and can't do and the state's ability to just dissolve them if they begin acting contrary to the will of the people.
Yeah. We need to bring Thomas Paine forward in time so he
we need his passion, that is for sure.
Yes. Oh. So I think that we can all agree that the way that we're living on the planet right now is failing by most metrics of how we measure the environmental health of our surroundings. We are losing ground every day, every year. There's more
Hmm.
development, there's more runoff, there's less healthy forest, there's more pollution. We do have some wins here and there, but they seem temporary and small in comparison to the big picture.
Hmm.
So, looking from that perspective at the system, I feel like whatever moral ascendancy the corporations have or the state has in terms of how we protect or fail to protect the environment, that should have been lost a
Hmm.
long time ago, and yet the system is still in place. I mean, Thomas Paine was railing about it however long ago, and here
Hmm.
we are.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think of rights of nature as not just a way to tackle the legal structures that we've put in place that are failing to protect the environment, but also as a way to create that cultural mind shift in how we see the world. Can you talk about that a
Hmm.
little bit?
Yeah. I mean, that's the heart of it, right? As I said earlier, it is a movement. And to my mind, you know, the, the fact that we're trying to change hearts and minds as well is what makes it a movement. We're after both legal and cultural change, and each one precipitates and influences the other. It's what the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund calls organizing jujitsu. Typically, we think of culture as influencing the character of the laws that a society enacts. And sometimes we think of laws as being passed in order to change cultural values. But what happens when the existing laws specifically reflect and reinforce the very values that need change? Well, the abolitionists, the suffragists, and the civil rights movement all face this dilemma. In our case, in order to change the laws, we have to transform cultural beliefs about nature being property. And in order to change the culture in this regard, we have to use the legal system to encourage that change. But when the current system of laws reinforces those values, we have to use the enforcement of the laws to show the unjust result and thereby inspire the public at large to change their beliefs about nature being property. Right? I mean, the mechanism is not new. We know this. Susan B. Anthony and countless other women had to be arrested repeatedly for trying to cast a ballot. Or, the unequal results of Jim Crow laws had to be brought to the public attention over and over again, whether by a lone woman refusing to move to the back of the bus or by a group of college students sitting at a lunch counter. That we're using the enforcement of those laws to sort of dramatize how unjust they are. And this is another reason why the rights of nature movement has to start at the local level. The public has to see time and time again how these local efforts to protect the environment by recognizing the fundamental rights of nature incur the wrath of the existing system, right? Like the efforts going on in Toledo, Ohio are to protect Lake Erie with the Lake Erie Bill of Rights are a fantastic example of how simply by doing so, the existing system is exposed, right? You look at the briefs submitted in that case and the corporate plaintiff in that case very clearly states, Lake Erie Bill of Rights violates our corporate civil rights and is preempted by state law. So here you have a group of citizens trying to protect a lake that is now largely green in the summer and their own drinking water. And yet these absurd rights and legal arguments that have been made over and over again are brought to the public attention. And so then we get to weigh, are these legal arguments, do these really sort of justify or win out over this very basic need to protect a lake and have potable drinking water? Um, so the goal with passing these local rights of nature laws or community bills of rights is precisely to provoke a response to the existing system in order to expose to the public at large these mechanisms of power, that the system, that we were talking about earlier. Because one of the reasons the system has been so effective is because it operates largely unseen and in the background. And it's done so for so long that we've forgotten to question it at all.
Well, and I also think about, when corporations got large enough that they could affect change or do their work remotely from where the owners of the corporation live,
Mm-hmm.
then
Mm-hmm.
that seemed like that was a big turning point, because then, like you said, then a lot of those actions go unseen, in terms of the CEOs don't have to drink the water that they're poisoning. So
Right.
they don't
Yeah.
worry about it because it doesn't affect them.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And so it's, that's another reason why I do think it's beautiful and necessary and wonderful that the rights of nature movement in the US is operating at the local level. It is the people who are witnessing the destruction, who are having to live through it, are the ones who are stepping up to protect the natural world and to speak for it. And just, because as you said, the entities perpetrating the destruction don't have to see it. And because they don't have to see it, I think it goes largely unseen by anybody outside that locality. And so the mere act of speaking up is bringing it to light. It's scary, but it is what needs to happen.
I worry that, the corporations already flagrantly abuse human rights and humans. And
Mm-hmm.
so getting our law to actually take a stand and enforce even just the human rights has been difficult, much less
Mm-hmm.
the rights of nature.
Mm-hmm.
So when I talked to Marky Miller about this, one thing she said, which I absolutely loved, was and a reminder of how long this process is, the people of Ecuador put rights of nature in their constitution like 10 years ago at this point. So
Mm-hmm.
she said there's a young generation of people who are growing up with that law in their constitution, and that's what they know. And
Mm-hmm.
eventually, hopefully, that will impact how people behave and how they treat nature and how they behave. They live in the world. And
Right.
you mentioned the Civil Rights Act. You mentioned women's suffrage. Those were long, long, long fights. They didn't happen
Yeah.
overnight. And I know for myself,
Yeah.
I want rights of nature to happen now. It needs to happen now.
Totally.
But it's not. It's
Totally.
going to take a long time, unfortunately.
Well, it is. And so I guess for myself, I've sort of tried to sublimate that need and to just acknowledge that that is not what our generation, I think, is called to do or to witness or to be part of. Our generations, living right now, are called to be the ones who start the process. So ultimately, this work isn't about us. It's about our kids, our grandkids, our great grandkids. It's about starting the process now so that eventually, like in Ecuador, there are generations of children who grow up where this is what is expected. The that that nature exists and has rights and is a subject is the norm. Um, so it reminds me of that wonderful line that Gandalf says in Fellowship of the Ring when Frodo is complaining about, despairing about why we have to do this. And he says something like, "So do all who face such times. But that is not ours to know. All we have to do is to ask, what are we to do with the time that we are given?" And we may not see that day where, nature, where we're living in balance with nature and respecting nature as a legal subject, but doggone it, I think we can be the ones to get that process going. And maybe that's all we're called to do right now.
I hope so. And it's so crazy because we used to be there, so we know we're capable of it. The indigenous
Mm-hmm.
peoples lived for thousands of years in places without destroying them. So
Mm-hmm.
we know we can do it.
Yeah.
We've just got to get there.
Yeah. Yeah. It is right. The human mind and the human spirit are capable of it. Absolutely.
Well, thank you. I think that's a good positive place to end. So
Absolutely. We need we need high notes in this struggle. So that's a good one to end on.
yes, we do. Well, thank you so much for your time, Sean. I really appreciate it, and thank you for your work.
Absolutely. This has been a pleasure. Thanks so much, Beth.